Good evening, everyone. I hope you're doing well. By now, everyone in Australia is aware that we're facing a housing and rental affordability crisis and an inflation slash cost of living crisis. And we're going to look at Senator Nick McKim today and his video on the housing crisis. And the thing is, what these guys, we'll have a play of his video in a sec. And of course, he's going to blame the 1% of the tax breaks. The I'll show data later, but just to give you the brief bullet points, the primary cause of the real estate bubble is the Reserve Bank of Australia, and I'll show all the money they printed, the manipulation of interest rates. Secondary to that would be the government with their stimulus programs into housing, like the 5% home deposit schemes not helping right now. And then the third thing, and keep in mind, I am not philosophically opposed to immigration, but the reality is that net migration, and we'll look at Canada and New Zealand that have seen 30% declines in their real estate markets and falling rents as a result of cutting migration. So we can't deny that mathematical reality. But of course, Senator McKim is not going to talk about any of that. He's going to talk about how bad the 1% are. Let's have a listen to what he has to say. And then we'll look at some charts and data to back up some of the things that he's getting correct, and also many of the things that, like, he's going to make the problem worse because he doesn't understand the problem, and his solutions are theft, more taxation, more government. None of this is going to work. But let's give him a chance to talk.
All right, I'm going to try and explain how the top 1% have completely rigged the housing system in Australia.
Okay, so his thesis to start the video is that, the top 1%, these greedy people, they're the ones rigging it against you. Quote, rigged the housing system. They even made a graphic to tell you that. Well, according to the Australian Tax Office, individuals earning an income of over 300, up to 300, sorry, $375,000 or over is what you need to earn to be in the top 1% in Australia. Now, many of you watching this video probably own an investment property, or you have a friend or family member that does. How many of them are earning over $375,000 per year? And I've done some background research on this, and I've created this little infographic. The 70% of real estate investors in Australia are people who earned less than $100,000 a year, their income, right? That's not the 1%, right? So he's saying the 1%'s rigged against you. The next 29% are people who earn between 100,000 and 375,000. So 99% of Australia's real estate investors are not in the 1%. The top 1% owns they're about 1% of real estate investors. Now, there's potential for that number to be a bit skewed. I couldn't get more detail on the data. Some of those top 1% people may own lots of properties. Maybe that's not quite captured in the data. I did ask when I was collating the research with the AI, I asked it to do this sort of stuff, but I'm willing to concede that maybe they're 2, 3, 4%, but they're definitely not the majority. They're a very small percentage of the real estate investors. And the next point he's going to make is the prices.
First thing to say is yes, it's a lot harder to buy your first home than it used to be.
It is a lot harder, but it's because of the government. It's because of inflation. It's because of our dying private sector. The RBA, let's just continue.
The last few decades, house prices have grown much faster than wages. 20 years ago, if you worked for a living, a house was worth about 4 times an annual income. Today, it's worth about 8 times.
Yeah, so he's right to point this out. I actually think it's worse than that. Here's one particular data set that shows Australia, the median, so it's the median, not the average, the median, I assume median home price and median income, 9.7 times income to buy the median house in Australia. You can see the decline in New Zealand and Canada. USA is only 4.8. So he's correct about that. The other point he made was about wages. Now, so this would be a whole other topic on its own, but over the past 20, 30 years, the government has made businesses so inefficient and driven up their costs. Now they have to pay 12% super. You've got companies like I think it was Westpac got successfully taken to court. They have to let their workers, fact check me on that, it was one of the big banks, they have to allow their workers to work from home. You've got all this like personal leave and these COVID lockdowns and regulations. All these things add costs to businesses. So the wages aren't keeping up, but the employer's cost isn't just the wages that the worker takes home. The business has to pay all these other taxes and regulatory costs and inefficiencies that the government imposes on them. The private sector has been shrinking by 10% in real terms in this country since 2018. But he's statistically correct to point that out. It's just that, house prices are keeping up with actual inflation, whereas wages, we've made our businesses and our workers so inefficient with so much government. So that would be a topic for another video. So let's put that aside.
The annual income. Basically, working hard is not enough anymore.
That's right. He's right about that.
The top 1% don't get rich by working. They get rich by buying and selling assets and making
That's
most.
true, but how did they buy and sell the assets in the first place? I mean, yes, some people have inheritance, but for a lot of rich people, they've worked hard. Maybe they studied hard, worked hard, started a business, saved money, so they didn't enjoy their money. They paid tax already on that money, and they take some of their after-tax money and invest it. We'll have a look at that in a sec. But
of a rigged and cooked tax system. So when they buy and sell a property, they only pay tax on half of the profit, thanks to the capital gains tax discount, the CGT.
Okay, so he's talking about the capital gains tax discount. If you've earned money, so let's say if you earned $100,000 this year, you paid income tax on that money, and you managed to save 10 grand, and you take your 10 grand and you invest it in something. I guess you can't invest in a house with 10 grand, but let's say over a few years you save 10 grand a year, you've paid income tax on that money already, so you've already paid tax. You do a responsible thing. You don't go out and spend and enjoy the money. You save the money, which is productive for society. Again, another conversation. Then you take the money and make an investment, right? Now, we've had lots of inflation. I mean, without showing you data, can we all agree that inflation has been out of control in Australia? And all houses are doing, you're not actually gaining wealth. If the house is going up 8 to 10% in price per year, it's probably just keeping up with the true rate of inflation, not the CPI, which is a very doctored measure. So you're not actually gaining as much wealth. You're gaining dollars, but you're not gaining wealth. That would be, so to tax it, for starters, I would say it's unethical to re-tax that money after it's already been taxed. You've done something responsible with it. I would prefer people invest in globally diversified portfolios of stocks, bonds, gold, other precious metals, real estate listed on the market, and have diverse portfolios. But the RBA and the Australian government has incentivized Australians to go more into property because the capital gains discount applies to stocks as well. Have a look at the terrible performance of the Australian stock market relative to other international markets, especially the US market, right? If capital gains discount is what's causing houses to go up in price so much, why aren't we seeing a bubble in the Australian stock market? Why is the Australian stock market, where investors get franking and tax credits beyond what you don't get franking and tax credits when you invest in real estate, so you get extra tax credits for investing in certain blue chip Australian companies like the big banks, right? But we're not seeing a massive bubble in the stock market, right? We're seeing the Australian stock market underperform international markets. So his argument doesn't fit there, but
now, the CGT discount is legit the most unfair tax break on the books in this country. It costs the budget $22 billion.
I hate that, cost the budget. The idea that not taxing something is a cost to the government, saying, well, the government could tax, fast food like McDonald's and make $5 billion a year. Therefore, because we're not taxing it, it's costing us $22 billion. This is Marxist propaganda that I would expect from a Green senator or from, quite frankly, from a lot of politicians. I don't agree with that. And it's not unfair. Like, if I've saved some money, I've paid income tax on it, I choose to invest that money, I make a good investment that produces a return, why am I paying tax again on that money? Why are we punishing people for saving and investing? At least allow working class folk to make X amount of capital gains per year. Maybe there's a cap, $50,000 or $100,000 that you're allowed to make, so that you don't get punished for doing something responsible. Maybe that's a compromise that myself and Senator McKim could come to.
Yeah, and 60% of the benefit goes to the top 1%. So if you go to work as a nurse or a cleaner or a tradie, you're paying twice the tax than a big property investor pays on the same amount of money.
No, that's not true, because, again, he's correct that the dollar amount of the tax quote break is going to the upper class, the 1%, right? But he's saying, oh, you're paying more tax as a nurse. No, the property investor in many cases already paid income tax on that money. He's just counting the capital gains tax portion and comparing it to the income tax that the nurse pays, ignoring some of the many of the other government benefits that working class people like nurses or tradies who have kids, maybe they're single parents. A lot of nurses are probably single. I know nurses who are single parents. They'd be receiving Centrelink benefits as a single parent, right? So they're paying 10 grand in tax and they're getting subsidized daycare, they're getting, the Medicare, they're getting the schools paid for, etc. So you're not factoring that in. Yes, the rich person gets that as well, but they get a disproportionate relative to their wealth and the tax that they pay. And then he's comparing income tax to capital gains tax. One, you need to compare the income tax that the rich person paid first before they made the investment or when they're holding the investment, and then the capital gains is added on top of that as part of their taxable income. So he's skewing the numbers, but let's give him some credit and show that where was that graph of this is where he's getting this data from, is that the negative gearing and capital gains tax discount, the dollar amount, right? I guess this is for 25 financial year. The dollar amount goes to the richest people. Now, they didn't define what the richest people are. Goes to the richest 10%. So that could be, when I showed this chart before, that could be a lot of people in this category who are earning $120,000 a year. So he's confusing some of the numbers. He's saying the 1% have rigged the game, but then when he quotes how much dollar value the rich are receiving in the quote tax benefit, he's including the top 10% of people, not the 1% of people. So this is where he's getting this data from. So again, he's picking numbers and, skewing. He's factually incorrect about some of the data. But let's keep in mind too, a rich person has a much higher tax rate. So if you're earning $100,000 a year, you have the tax-free threshold. You have the 47% tax rate doesn't kick in until I believe $188,000 a year. All right, so the rich person has more money to buy a more expensive asset, and they earn the majority of their income. If they're in the 1%, they're earning the majority of their income at the highest marginal tax rate of 47%. So when they're negatively geared or they claim a capital gains tax discount, they have a much higher tax rate, therefore they benefit from the deduction more. If you're on a super low income, if you're just working, if you're studying and working part-time, you only make $15,000 a year working on weekends, you pay zero income tax. So you can't claim a negative gearing or capital gains tax discount because you have no income tax to pay. Therefore, you get no dollar benefit. So you see what I mean? Like it's not, and it's not a fair presentation of the statistics. All right, so rich people have higher incomes, they earn more income, they pay a much higher income tax rate. So when they claim a deduction, whether it's for negative gearing or interest costs on the loan or whatever, they get more back, and that's what skews this number. And that's something that he's being dishonest about. He probably doesn't understand this anyway. He's just got his agenda is the 1% is bad, tax everyone.
And that's not all. They can use the equity and the profits to buy more homes. The more homes they own, the more homes they can buy, and the more out of reach a home becomes for you. Then they use
so one of the things, so I'm going to jump ahead to one of my solutions. Now, I don't like the government getting involved, but to compromise with Senator McKim, he's big government guy, loves government. One of the things the government could do, which he doesn't talk about, I don't know why he doesn't understand this, APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, they regulate the banks. They tell the banks, like, okay, you have to assess people at a 3% buffer. So if they're going to loan you money at a 5% mortgage rate, the bank has to assess and make sure you can pay at 8%. Well, what APRA could do, and again, I'm not advocating this, but why someone like Senator McKim, who wants government intervention, because he's, talking about, the greedy 1%, they keep buying all these properties, and if they're negatively geared, that means they borrowed money to buy the property. All right. I made a video about this, the solution to Australia's housing affordability crisis. Why not just ask this would cost the government no money. Well, it might cost them indirectly in terms of less tax revenue collected, but they could just tell APRA, right? Because last year, 40% of loans to buy real estate went to investors. And Nick McKim is upset about the 1% recycling and borrowing more money to buy more assets, claiming negative gearing discounts and tax discounts and all that. Just have APRA, the banking regulator, tell the banks there's an 18-month freeze on lending to investors to buy property. That's it. Won't cost any money. Just have APRA say to the banks, you can only loan money to people to buy a house if they're buying the house to live in the house. If they want to borrow money to buy an investment property, which they're going to negatively gear and claim tax breaks, as he calls them, just have a freeze on those loans. So if you want to buy the house as an investment, you go ahead and cough up all the cash and pay cash for it. And that will probably get rid of 80 to 90% of investors out of the market. What it would do is start to bring down housing prices as well, because all of a sudden, 40% of people who, I believe it was in the second half of 2025, 40% of people who borrowed money to buy a house were investors. You take 40% of them out of the market, they can't borrow money. So 40% of people borrowing money to buy a house, you take those investors out of the market because they can't get a loan because APRA told the banks you're not allowed to loan money to people to buy real estate. Real estate prices would drop, investors would drop, they'd be out of the market. I mean, what? How can you not understand just a simple solution like this? I haven't heard any of these politicians talk about that. So we'll go back to the video and see what he's saying.
Mortgage repayments as tax deductions. It's called negative gearing, and it costs the budget about $6 billion a year.
He's saying it costs the taxpayer. How can you pay income tax when you don't have income? Right, so you bought the investment property, you're collecting $600 a week in rent, and you're paying $700 in cost to keep that asset. You're paying the mortgage, you're paying the interest, you're paying the insurance costs, the council rates, the maintenance, the property manager fees, right? You're not making money, right? If I am running a business, right, and I have to buy, let's say I'm not good with trades and stuff like with being a tradesman, but let's say I'm an electrician and I have to buy a specific tool to do a job, and that tool costs me, it's some kind of electronic detection device, whatever it is. I'm not a tradesman, I'm a nerd. And it cost me $3,000 to buy this piece of equipment, but I only earned $2,500 doing the job. Well, I've lost $500, right? I don't pay tax until I start making money. So it's, anyway, but the fact that they're negatively geared tells you how, like, I'm not saying rents need to go up. I don't want rents to go up. I want to let housing prices come down by getting the RBA and the government out of the market and looking at migration. But that tells you how low rents are, that landlords, generally speaking, landlords are charging you less rent than what it's costing them to keep the home. So they're speculators. They're just hoping the price goes up. So as soon as prices stop going up, which could be achieved with higher interest rates, anyway, let's have a listen to what else he has to say.
Using a self-managed super fund, they get even more tax breaks. All of these tax breaks overwhelmingly flow to the wealthiest people in our country, which makes it so much harder for everyone else to get ahead. And
Well,
if you're
yeah, again, we looked at that earlier. He's correct about the dollar amount that's flowing to the richer people, but they've already paid way more tax, right? So if you're going to count the dollar benefit they're getting, how about you look at the net dollar amount of tax that they pay? How much have they paid in income tax and business tax over the years? If they're earning $350,000, $400,000 a year and they're paying the vast majority of their income at the 47% tax rate, right? They're just getting a little bit back, but how much have they paid overall anyway?
thinking, oh, sounds a little bit unfair, you're absolutely right.
It's not unfair.
Completely cooked, and it's why it's easier for a property investor to buy their sixth home or their 60th.
Well, of course, it's going to be easier to buy your sixth home. If you're wealthy enough that you own 5 houses, you got a lot of money or a lot of equity or a lot of debt at your disposal to buy more stuff. I mean, that's course, that's how it is. Obviously, it's easier for Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or someone to buy a house than it is for the 19-year-old working at Coles or Woolies. That's just,
And someone to actually buy their first home. Our tax system incentivises property speculation, which means that everyday buyers are competing with property speculators, which drives up prices. It means that homes, which should be a human right, are just an investment class. And the reason we're in this situation is because Labor, the Liberals, the Nationals... Okay,
so he's going to say they're all in there, they all go to the same parties, blah, blah,
we
blah.
don't just...
Right. So what does he want to do? Tax? Let's see what he wants to do.
We want to fix it. And that means taxing the 1%. And the good thing about taxing the 1%...
So the way to fix it is to tax the 1%. We're going to look at a lot more data in a sec, but does that sound to you like it's going to fix the problem? Anyway, I'm probably finished listening to this guy.
If we want to get into the market, there is just no good...
So he thinks...
More houses, all the scales in the housing market too. If we taxed property speculators properly, they might even have to sell some homes, which would free up more houses for renters trying to get into the market.
Okay, so one of the cases he's making is that obviously he wants to scrap the capital gains tax discount, right? And I don't understand why he doesn't get basic math, right? If you scrap the capital gains tax discount, the short term reaction is that you're probably going to have fewer investors selling their houses and you'll probably push housing prices up more. Now, the reason being, and take it from me, I've had conversations with clients about this, not with real estate investments. I'm a stockbroker by trade. I'm not here to give investment advice, but I've had clients that have had positions. So let's just bring the housing example in. You've bought an investment property in Sydney 10 or 15 years ago. You paid the median price, which was about $800,000 at the time. Those houses now sell for 1.6, 1.7 million. Now, I understand there are other deductions in play and depreciation and all that, but let's say that particular investor might be sitting on a capital gain. If they sell that property, they might have a $600,000, $700,000 capital gain liability, right? So if they sell that house and they have to pay it at their top mark, because he's talking about the 1%, so they have to pay a 47% tax rate on that, they might have a $300,000 tax bill, right? If there's a capital gains tax discount of 50%, their capital gains tax bill is only $150,000. If you scrap that discount, it might cost them, they might lose an additional $150,000, maybe an additional $200,000 from selling that piece of real estate, right? You're talking about maybe up to 10%. 10, 12% of the value of their asset, you're going to take extra in tax, not total tax. You're going to take an extra 10% in tax. What that does is the real estate investor goes, you know what? That's going to cost me a lot of money to sell that investment. Even if it drops 10% in price, or I don't get to raise my rents much because he succeeds in freezing rents, it's still better off to hold the asset, because if I hold the asset for another 5 years, it'll probably, I mean, most real estate investors think the prices will just keep going up anyway. But even if the price stays flat, you don't lose that massive amount in capital gains tax. I know for a fact I've had clients, many clients who won't sell an investment because they're sitting on too large a capital gains tax bill. And if they sell it, they're going to lose a lot of money paying capital gains tax. And generally, as a stockbroker, what I do is if someone's sitting on a massive gain, say for example, the investment is gold bullion and they bought it a few years ago, I've always advised my clients to have some gold. So they bought it at $1,500 or $2,000 an ounce back in 2020, roughly, and now it's sitting at $4,500 an ounce. What we can do is we can do things like buy investments to hedge that. You can short gold, you can go long the US dollar, etc. So instead of paying capital gains, you buy an investment that moves the opposite price so that you're effectively selling. People do it in more complicated fashions by writing call options and stuff like that. Again, I'm not allowed to give advice on any of this stuff. I'm just trying to demonstrate a case that by removing the discount, if anything, if you want people to sell their houses, if you want property investors to get out of the market, what you should be doing is getting rid of capital gains tax altogether, or increasing the discount, or saying to now, this is an idea I'd need to make a whole other video about. But what you could do is say to real estate investors, okay, if you sell your house, we won't charge you capital gains tax, but for 5 years, you have to put the sale proceeds into a 5 or 10 year government bond. And this will be special issued government bonds that will be used to fund, infrastructure projects. Maybe we build high speed rail, or we build a new airport, or we build, new power plants or something like that. Again, I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I don't like the government doing any of this stuff. I'm just trying to operate in the world that Nick McKim operates in, because in his world, there is no possibility of a free market. So there are lots of ways the government could address this. Anyway, I've been going on for a long time. So let's have a look at some more data. Firstly, inflation is, so I'm going to show you some data on inflation. The Australian government, so the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and the Australian Bureau of Statistics rental costs, they showed from 2020 to 2025 that rents went up about 18 to 20%. Actual advertised rents are up 45%. So when he talks about how much real estate's gone up in price, and that, there's all these gains there that need to be taxed, not really. A lot of it is just inflation. All right? Inflation is far worse than the government's saying. So they say inflation right now is 4.6%. I would argue it's probably double whatever the government says. And that's, again, I've made many videos about how the government misreports inflation. Housing costs are a big part of the CPI. A third of I believe it's 35% of the country rents property, and they spend on average 33% of their income on rent. So it's a big part of their costs. It's a big part of CPI, and the government is massively underreporting this. So when they say inflation's 4.6%, they're saying rental costs have only gone up 20%, where in reality they've gone up 45%. Global housing prices, they've gone up far more in Australia than they have in other countries since the 1990s. We looked at this chart earlier. property investors who are negatively geared. Again, notice that the property investors who only own one property, half of them are negatively geared, but as you get to six or more properties, the negative gearing rate comes down. So the rich are not quite as negatively geared, but we could assume that someone who owns six properties is probably fairly rich. Now, here's one of the problems that people like Senator McKim don't talk about, and it's the Reserve Bank of Australia and the role that they played to pump the real estate bubble. And I'm just checking how long I've gone, 25 minutes already. I'll try and hustle through some of this. During COVID, the RBA printed about $500 billion during COVID. When I say print, they invented dollars in their computer. 188 billion of that was the term funding facility. So this guy's talking about, all these subsidies property investors get, and, the big greedy corporations are ripping you off, and the supermarkets are price gouging you with their $1 billion profit a year, which is less than 3%. Why aren't you talking about the Reserve Bank of Australia, the 188 billion from the term funding facility? So what that was is, and if you want to fact check me, Google it. I'm very aware of this. I've researched it. The Reserve Bank of Australia printed money. They invented $188 billion in their computer, which they loaned to the banks for 3 years at 0.25% and 0.1% interest. So let's have a look at who borrowed it. It's all publicly available on the website. Maybe I'll just zoom in a bit so you can read it a bit easier. Commonwealth Bank took 51 billion, NAB took 31 billion, Westpac 29 billion, ANZ $20 billion. Talk about a subsidy for corporations. This guy will talk about the mining companies getting these. They're not even subsidies that the mining companies get. But what about these subsidies to the banks, where Commonwealth Bank got to borrow $51 billion at a fraction of a percent of interest, and then they turn around and loan it to you to pay 3, 4, 5, 6% on your mortgage, and they make a massive profit? He's not talking about that, of course. He's talking about all the greedy 1%. It's 1%. No, talk about the RBA. And one of the things the RBA does, and I'll talk about this chart in a sec, is they act as a backstop for banks. And the banks know this. So the banks can go out and loan people $3 million to buy a crappy rundown house in Sydney, because they know if it goes well, they'll collect massive amounts of interest payments, make a massive profit. And if it goes badly, well, the RBA will just print money and bail them out. And the RBA has talked about unconventional monetary policy, and I've seen speeches from Philip Lowe, the former governor of the RBA, praising what the US did, Federal Reserve did in 2008, where they buy toxic mortgages off the banks. So the banks can package up all the mortgages where people aren't paying and sell them to the RBA. Again, probably a topic for another video, but you get the point. The RBA is in there propping up the banks. And have a look in Australia, most banks, like in other nations, 30 or 40% of their loans are to residential mortgages. In Australia, this is a few years old. I believe this is from 2022. It's probably worse now. 62%, and this is RBA data, I've seen it from the RBA, 62 or over 60% of bank loans in Australia are to residential mortgages, right? And I talked earlier in the video about, you could just tell APRA, the banking regulator, to say no more loans to real estate investors if that's the problem. I mean, I don't like government interfering in the market, but that would be one thing that I would probably tolerate, because the problem's so big that I would be willing to compromise with someone like. And this is the RBA's balance sheet. So essentially, this measures how much money they've printed. Again, they don't physically print money. It's just a crude term that we use to explain something very complicated. You can see during the 2008 crisis, the RBA went from. So what the RBA does is they generally buy government bonds, so government debt. So bonds or IOUs. They probably have some, short-term loans that they've facilitated, but they help out the banking sector, so they might buy some short-term bank debt or make short-term loans to banks. I couldn't tell you which portion of their balance sheet is that, but I can tell you that this portion here, so when COVID hit, and this is one of the reasons why the COVID lockdowns were so dangerous from an economic perspective, ignoring the health issue. That's not for me to comment on, but I'm sure many of you can probably theorize as to what I think about that. The RBA went from a balance sheet of about 180 billion to over 600 billion. So from low to high, they printed roughly 500 billion. Maybe I'm skewing it a bit. Maybe it was more like 450 billion. This chart cuts off. I believe it got a little bit higher, but that was them buying up government debt. So the reason they bought government bonds is because when you overpay for bonds, so the RBA invents money in their computer, they go into the market and they overpay for government debt, and that pushes up the price of the government debt and brings the interest rate down. They were able to bring the interest rate, they had a program where they were targeting up to the 3 year government bond, making sure that that interest rate was capped at 0.1% for 3 year loans to the government. And that was them essentially rigging the housing market because mortgage rates based off, base rates like 3 year government bond yield or the RBA rate. So by bringing those rates, most people in Australia, they either have variable loans or if they fix, they only fix for 2 or 3 years. So the RBA was massively, they spent $450 billion artificially suppressing interest rates during COVID so that the banks could make, and we showed the term funding facility, which is part of this balance sheet. They sent loans out to the banks and said, here you go, banks, here's an extra $188 billion at a super low rate of interest. Go and loan money to people to speculate in real estate. And this guy makes video, and a lot of these guys, they never talk about the Reserve Bank of Australia. And this is Australia's money supply. So there's many ways to measure it, but you can see in 2020, our M3 money supply, which is a broader measure of money. You can see just before COVID hit, February 2020, money supply, I believe that's trillions because that's thousands of billions. So money supply was at maybe 2.2 trillion almost. Look where it is today. They've grown the money supply by roughly 50%. The more dollars in the economy circulating around, it creates inflation. It goes into asset bubbles like real estate. Where do you think all this money's going? A lot of it's going into real estate. All right. And now let's look at some of the government's intervention, is some more shorter term stuff. So we recently got data for the first 6 months from October to the end of March. The government's 5% deposit scheme. The government said that prices would go up less than 1% over a 5 year period, I believe it was. And within the first 6 months, have a look at the price growth. Now, this graph breaks it down between, because obviously homes that cost $4 million don't qualify for the 5% deposit scheme. So they've broken this down. So homes, so the blue, roughly a blue color, sorry, I don't know what color to call that, but this bluish color, these are homes that were below the price cap, meaning that they were eligible for the 5% deposit scheme. Have a look at how much they went up in price, not in 6 years, just in 6 months when the government said prices would go up less than 1%, that it wouldn't affect housing prices. Well, in Sydney, they went up 4.1%, while houses above the cap actually fell in price. Same thing in Melbourne, a small increase in Melbourne, but other houses went down in price, right? Brisbane, 13%. Adelaide, 9.4%. Look at Perth, 18.2%. What do you think's going to happen when a bunch of people who don't normally qualify for a bank loan to buy a house, the government suddenly steps in and goes, here you go, we'll help you get a 95% LVR loan. So you've got to borrow 95% of the cost of the house and pay interest on that in a rising interest rate environment. So the government's helped all these people take on massive debts to overpay for houses, massive mortgage, borrowing 95% of the amount. And look at how much the prices went up. Do you think it's a coincidence that the price of the houses that qualified for the 5% deposit scheme went up more than the price of the other houses? I mean, I don't have enough raw data to say whether it was investors getting in ahead of time or is it just a consequence of regular buying from people. Now let's talk about migration. And we'll talk about New Zealand, the decline in New Zealand. But first, I'm looking at the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics official website. All right, let's have a look at the population change from 2021 to 2025. Net overseas migration. So the blue line is our actual population growth, total growth of population. Notice the orange line is almost exactly the same because almost all of our population growth is coming from net overseas migration. And let's have a look at what happened in New Zealand when we. So I've got more data on Australia's migration. Let's have a quick look. There's lots of different ways to measure it. This is normal migration in the 40s to the 2000s, and then massive growth in the last couple of years. In I guess that was 2025, 500,000 people coming in, net overseas migration per day in office. I mean, doubling under Albanese. Again, all government is bad. Abbott, Turnbull, Howard, all bad, but Albanese, just pushing the agenda further. Temporary visas on issue, again, record numbers. However you want to measure it. Sorry, this chart's not zoomed in. Long-term arrivals, net arrivals in the green, over 500,000 people coming in 2025. So I'm just showing you different versions of the data so that we can see. I mean, you get the point. net permanent and long-term arrivals for the 12 months to January. So this would go to maybe 2026. Again, look at the massive spike in population. So again, I'm not philosophically opposed to immigration, but I understand the math. So New Zealand has experienced a 30% inflation-adjusted decline in housing prices from 2022 to now. And what did New Zealand do? Well, so you can see the declines in the cities there. Or this is indexed, it goes up to 300, so it's about 280, and they've come down to the two, well, Wellington's down to 210, so probably a bigger decline in Wellington, but the rest of the country, 25 to 30% decline. And if you want, depending on whether you adjust it for inflation or not. And what did New Zealand do? Well, here we see New Zealand down here on the left, right? This is the net migration. What did they do in 2024 and 2025? Massive negative net migration. So losing population or going backwards in terms of migration. So New Zealand allowed their population to decline and the real estate market declined. Now, correlation is not causality, but it's hard to deny because we'll look at Canada. These are two similar economies, two socialist economies, economies that previously had they've they did the lockdowns. We've got similar sort of, we have the socialized healthcare or sick care, the sort of socialist governments. Canada, this is from the Federal Reserve, again, official source. This goes back to the 70s, but you can see Canadian prices peaked. These are real residential property prices in Canada, peaked on the index 198 in Q1 of 2022, down to 145. That's a 28% decline. Could you imagine real estate in Australia with all the debt we have and real estate investors already negatively geared, losing cash flow every month? If real estate prices declined by 28% in Australia, could you imagine what that would? I mean, real estate prices need to fall. I'm not against real estate prices falling. I just want, I'd prefer a free market where there's no RBA suppressing interest rates and banks would have to, they would be taking a lot of risk to loan money to people to buy houses. Let's have a look at Canada again, the population decline, because we looked at the price decline in their real estate, massive decline, right? Now, this is the population and rent. So you can see going back to the late 90s, you can see the red dotted line is rents, and then the blue line is the change in population. So they're measuring the percentage change in rents versus the population. You can see there's absolutely a correlation. Once they let the population explode post-COVID, they did the Australia plan, let everyone come in, let the immigration, let everyone come in, rents went up. And then what did they do? In 2025, they allowed a population decline. Let me just get out of that. You can see in 2025 was the first year that Canada's population declined, but note it started decline, like it peaked. So the rate of increase peaked in 2023, 2024, population declined, the real estate market followed lower. Pretty obvious. And then rents came down. So rents peaked, in 2024, and rents have been falling a little bit. And then Australia, there's rents in Australia, so going straight up. And then a little quick bit more data on Canada. We could just see that same chart again, but we can see the population decline. This breaks it down, net. We're looking natural, net migration, permanent residents, net emigration. You can see that they allowed population so it peaked in 2022. That's when the housing market hit the peak, and then the population was allowed to decline, or immigration was slowed or paused, and then there was an actual population decline, and then down come the real estate markets, down came rent. And we've looked at all that again. So, for me, I'm just going to wrap this up really quickly because I've talked for a long time. My preferred solution, which would never happen, would be to abolish the Reserve Bank of Australia, get rid of the backstop for the commercial banks, and tell Commonwealth Bank, ANZ, National Australia Bank, if you're going to loan money to people to overpay for this real estate, you're going to take the risk, and we're not going to have a government agency suppressing the interest rate for you, because obviously, if there's no RBA, then in order for someone to borrow $2 million to buy a house, someone else has got to save it or put capital into the bank, or the bank's got to borrow the money in the private market. They can't get these cheap loans from the RBA like they did during COVID. Now, they're not getting those now, but the RBA is there holding down rates, or there's this implied safety net for the banks to backstop. Again, like I said, not opposed to immigration, but I understand the math. So if we were to just say, hey, we just need to pause it for a year or two, if 10 people come in, then 10 more people have to leave. We just need to stay neutral. That would, as we saw from Canada and New Zealand, that would probably most likely bring down housing prices and rents. I still think, if you just do the immigration side of things, the RBA will be there cutting rates and stimulating and loaning money to banks. So they will, as housing prices fall, they'll stimulate. We'll go into recession because we have a real estate mega hyper bubble economy. Our GDP is heavily tied to real estate and to banking, active bank lending to real estate. So I think if all you did was pause the migration, we'd go into recession. And what's the RBA going to do in a recession? They're going to cut rates, and that creates more inflation and boosts the housing market. But the third problem, and sorry, the third solution, and the easiest one that compromises with the Marxists like Greens Senator Nick McKim, is why not just have APRA, and you watch my video about that. It's called Solution to the Housing Crisis that no one's talking about. I should have got the day on that, but I'm sure if you Google that, you'll easily be able to find it. Look for it on YouTube, sorry. Simpler solution that directly costs no dollars to the government or to the taxpayer. I understand there'll be flow on consequences, but something's got to give, right? Just tell APRA no new loans. And I showed some of the data in this video about all the loans. And, I talked about how, APRA has intervened in similar ways before. Like they have the power to do this if they wanted to. Just, Senator McKim, just ask APRA, mate, just ask APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, to put a freeze on lending to real estate investors. So property investors can't borrow money for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. Well, just start nice and easy so we don't interfere with the market too much. Just make it a 6 month freeze, no new loans to real estate investors. Let's see how it goes for 6 months. If it's not having the desired effect, extend it for another 6 months. Anyway, hopefully this provides a little bit more data and context to Australia's real estate problem. And I seriously doubt any of Nick McKim or any of his people will bother watching this. And even if they did watch it, they would hate my solutions because I'm a greedy free market capitalist. So, you know, I don't expect anything to come from it, but I have a passion for, whether I'm right or wrong, I'm trying my best to be well educated on these topics and share it with others. And I have been working in a professional capacity as a financial advisor for 16 years now. And prior to that, I was a derivatives trader, and I do a lot of this as a hobby as well. So hopefully, I have some insight for you. If anyone's made it this far, comment below what a bloody legend you are. Thank you so much. Cheers.